Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm Benedict Macdonald. I'm a sort of lifelong naturalist, nature person, not naturist, as somebody asked me the other day. That's something entirely different. And I've always been in love with the British countryside, and also very aware that even in my reasonably short lifetime, the birds particularly, but all of the nature that I grew up with has been really viscerally and visually vanishing in front of my eyes. And that's kind of been playing out for, all of our lifetimes, and it's actually been playing out for thousands of years, as I'll come to in a minute. Professionally, I started off as a filmmaker on the David Attenborough series, which was an amazing opportunity and an amazing chance to see ecosystems as they should be, both farmland ecosystems like in Eastern Europe, where you count your turtle doves by the 50 rather than the 1, but also living original systems in Eastern Europe, in Yellowstone, in many different parts of the world, in Mongolia, where you've got the wild horses creating these incredible grassland landscapes. So I sort of increasingly came back to Britain with a sense of what the hell have we done with it. And that informed quite a lot of my thinking behind my first book, Rebirding, which was the product of years of kind of looking at where have all the birds gone. And that journey kind of took me not back to the 1970s and then not back to the 1760s, but actually all the way back to when we kind of de-wilded Britain, and we've done a pretty good job of it. So when Rebirding came out, the reason I wrote it and published it was I wanted everybody, but particularly farmers, to understand where the birds had actually gone. Because we always talk about every species as if it's got its own separate niche, and corn buntings need corn and turtle doves need arable, and none of this is true. And if you're basing a conservation system on a load of stuff that isn't true, how can you possibly hope to recover birds if you're telling them that they need things that they really don't need, and they're telling you they don't need it because they keep going extinct? So when I brought out Rebirding, I wanted to kind of give landowners and farmers and conservationists as well a kind of vision for what we used to have, how we lost it, why we've actually lost the nature we have. There are all sorts of strange reasons you always hear about, which are never the actual reasons nature's declined. And then most importantly, what we could do to put it back, both in the rewilded future landscapes of our deer estates and grouse moors, the non-food producing areas that are really just wasted, and also how we could put nature back into the productive farmed areas and what a productive farmed area for nature could and should look like. So in the early sort of stages of Rebirding, I kind of looked a lot at, farmland, the myth of the farmland bird. Of course, there's no such thing as a farmland bird, because birds are millions of years old. Every species we've got in this country predates arable farming by north of 2 million years. So self-evidently, none of these species need farmland to survive, but for hundreds of years prior to intensification, they were able to use farmland to survive. And often that's because the systems that we created entirely by accident were really good for nature. So orchards, lake-cut hay meadows, all of these things replicating wood pasture, replicating floodplains, replicating original systems, even though no farmer was sat there going, oh, this is great, I'm replicating an original system. It was purely non-intensive food production happened to create an extraordinary byproduct of wild food for wild birds and nature. And we were able to sustain this system for thousands of years, from the Neolithic really until about the 1750s, which sounds quite a long time ago. Well, we know that's when birds really started to decline, was actually from the early 1800s onwards, not from the 1970s, as we're always told, as if this is some kind of halcyon baseline that we want to return to. By the 1970s, most of our redback shrikes, wrynecks, corncrakes, turtle doves, spotted flycatchers had already gone. So this concept of farmland bird decline being the fault of any particular farmer or generation alive is firstly untrue and therefore unhelpful, because in reality birds have been declining for hundreds of years. So why is nature declining here in the UK? It may seem obvious, but I'm going to spell it out. So the key thing that's happened in the last 100 years is we have collapsed the food chain for everybody except us as a species. We've taken away weeds, we've taken away seeds, we've taken away wood decay, we've taken away structural complexity, we've even toxified dung beetles with ivermectins. we've basically eradicated the very basis of the food chain, and by fertilising large areas of the countryside, we've created entirely homogeneous grassland systems that swallow all of the fine flowers and nectar and food plants on which nature depends for survival. So effectively what we've had from the time of enclosure onwards across the 19th and 20th centuries into the 21st is a journey from extreme heterogeneity, variety, to extreme sameness and monoculture. And this has happened in all sorts of different ways, from the clearance of old orchards, so the removal of those wood pasture systems that would have been sustaining a lot of the birds from the wild wood days, lesser spotted woodpeckers, spotted flycatchers, all the way to removing the little bits of scruffiness writ large that turtle doves and tree sparrows and grey partridges depended on. In the pre-enrichment days of farming, any arable margin would become colonised by broadleaf weeds, and prior to glyphosate and other herbicides, you would have had turtle dove habitat squeezed into the margins of arable farms all across eastern and southern England. But that doesn't mean that the turtle dove ever needed those habitats or liked those habitats. Those were simply the habitats and the choices that we gave the turtle dove in recent times. So if, for example, you go to the hills of northern Spain, where you'll find joyously high numbers of turtle doves and nightingales, none of them are in arable landscapes at all. They're all in grazing landscapes and wood pasture landscapes. If you go to Hungary, you'll find nightjars nesting in farmland. They're not a heathland species, and they never were a heathland species here in the UK. And also, if you go to places like Herefordshire and the Malverns, you'll still be able to find lesser spotted woodpeckers nesting in orchards. So nature doesn't think in habitat blocks, and it doesn't think in farmland types. We do, but it's actually really unhelpful for conservation to not think like the species that you're trying to conserve. So if you look at a turtle dove, it needs to nest in something spiky and dense. So we say, oh, it needs to nest in a hedgerow. No, it doesn't need to nest in a hedgerow, it needs to nest in something spiky and dense. After the enclosure of farmland, we began putting scrub in straight lines. Most of nature was fairly okay with that, but it is extraordinary when you hear about creating hedgerows. Why are we creating a livestock perimeter fence from the 1700s? Why don't we talk about creating scrub, creating habitat? And by all means, if that comes in a line and makes a hedgerow because it suits the cultural or agricultural norms of that farm, it's better to have a hedgerow and scrub than no scrub. But really, most of these species evolved in these broken, chaotic, open landscapes where scrub was randomly dotted around and scrub was adjacent to grassland. And there are a whole load of species like cuckoos that hate straight lines. Nature doesn't like straight lines, we do. So when you look at the edge of a forestry block, it's only in that scruffy hinterland of sort of juniper and willow and birch that you still find black grouse in Galloway. But they've just been pushed into these margins, into these lines. But, conventionally they would have been in these kind of broken, open landscapes. When you look at what turtle doves actually need, they need a spiky bush to nest in that's fairly magpie-proof. And they need lots and lots of different weed seeds that are small, which they then take to a pond. Most ponds, of course, have been taken out of the farmland landscape or nitrified in the last 50 years. They then basically turn the seeds into a mulch and they fly back to feed it to their chicks. They're not insectivorous. They're one of the few birds that are entirely seed dependent. And we've managed to weed 97% of turtle doves out of the UK since 1970, which, as I've said already, is an artificial baseline. So when we think about birds, the key premise I outlined in Rebirding and we work with all our farmers on is think about food for birds. Think about the trophic pyramid, the trophic cascade, and think about building food chains from the bottom up. Because unless you're going to be doing a wolf reintroduction on your farm, the only way we can repair landscapes in the UK in farmland areas is from the bottom up. So soil, weeds, seeds, insects, turtle doves, things that prey on turtle doves, and so on and so forth. So we've got a lot of conservation wrong because we've basically based it on modifying farmland back to 1970, 1950, instead of thinking what do these species actually need to survive. Now, if you take a trophic approach, a food-based approach, though, it's actually very hard to go wrong. A place to nest and a place to feed. Normally birds are more Catholic about where they nest than where they feed. So if you look at a swift, it can nest in an old tree hole, not that they do very often anymore, and it can nest in a house. If you look at a spotted flycatcher, it can nest in anything from a missing brick to an orchard tree, but if it can't intercept 90,000 flying insects per bird per summer spent in the UK, they winter in Africa obviously, then it's not going to survive, let alone be able to feed its chicks. And as soon as you start thinking about the number of invertebrates that an individual bird, like a cuckoo, needs, which I actually calculated in rebirding, it's staggering we have any cuckoos left in England at all. And I was going to say it's staggering we have any red-backed shrikes, but we don't. So an average cuckoo, whatever that looks like, needs to consume around 100,000 hairy caterpillars a year, one bird. So imagine how many hairy caterpillars a population of cuckoos needs. Well, a population of cuckoos needs to sustain around 50 breeding pairs. That's 100 individuals. And that needs to squeeze into an area the size of the New Forest. In other words, these birds need massive landscapes to survive. So not only do they need an extraordinary quantity of seeds and insects, it's no good having one or two of each or some tokenistic buffer strip. Then you need to multiply the food that the bird needs by the scale that it needs to sustain a population of that bird, not just one of a kind. This is one of the biggest problems with small nature reserves, being actively dangerous for conservation, and I use that phrase advisedly, is the nightingales, cuckoos, lesser spotted woodpeckers, willow tits. These are described by the BTO as birds of the wider countryside, but every bird is a bird of the wider countryside. Black grouse, ring ouzel, pick hawfinch, pick your bird. Virtually nothing can survive in a small postage stamp of a few hundred acres of intensively managed habitat, because when that habitat changes and the nightingales come back from Africa the next year and the scrub isn't lovely and thick and down to the ground, normally because the deer have got in and nibbled the bottom of it, they've got nowhere else to go. Which is why, ironically, brownfield sites like the Cotswold Water Park, which never set out to conserve nightingales, have done a much better job than sites that set out to conserve nightingales. Because every time there's a new gravel pit is taken out of circulation, you get a new level of scrub, and if the nightingales arrive 1 year and they can't nest here, they can just up sticks and nest over here. Which, of course, brings us back to farmland. The only way we can create scalable bird populations in the UK is through farms and farm clusters, because most of the countryside is farmland. 1% is owned by our NGOs, and it is simply too small, demonstrably, to be holding on to species, whether that's cuckoos, lesser spotted woodpeckers, or corn buntings. So farmland has to pick up this kind of double task, double calling of creating food en masse, weeds, seeds, and insects, and then spreading that back out into the 100-kilometre level if we want to have any chance of saving any of these species. So it's pointless to think about specific, very costly interventions and buffer strips and all these other things that the countryside stewardship has paid us for. Nature doesn't really care about any of that. It needs scale and it needs food. And to create the food, you need heterogeneous landscapes, you need variety, you need orchards, you need scruffy areas, you need rotting elder, you need trees and fields that are allowed to just senesce and die quietly. And most importantly, of course, we need to take the inputs out at a massive scale if we want to have any chance at all of conserving our nature. And the good news is the people to do that, and the only people with the resourcefulness and the land and the scale to do that, are farmers. NGOs can't do it, owning 1% of the UK. And this is why we set up Restore. We might be famous for the rewilding stuff and the big sort of projects like the Isle of Tarrant. It's an uninhabited island that we are sort of turning back to Atlantic rainforest, very exciting. But the things that really motivate me are scaling farmland nature restoration. Because when you know why things have departed your land, it's much easier to put them back. So the key thing then to think about is anything that holds back the bottom of the food chain. Not to think too much about what that habitat's called, or even immediately what grant you're going to get for it, although that's something I'll come to later. But to think about building that food chain from the bottom up. Farmers are very good at feeding people, now they need to become very good at feeding nature. And they are the best people placed to do that. Recently, we've begun working with some really exciting farm clusters from Oxfordshire to the Pevensey levels, because farm clusters are what enable the scale that I was talking about. You know, I've had so many farmers who own maybe 300 to 500 acres saying, well, there's nothing wrong with my land, where have all the cuckoos gone? And I said, well, it sounds like you're doing everything right, and your land represents half a pair of cuckoos. If you want to save a population of cuckoos, you need to be working at that, you know, that 50 to 100 kilometre level, which is why farm clusters are so necessary and why farm clusters are so exciting. So the key thing then is thinking about how do we begin to reinstate wild food, and that then comes down to habitat creation. And again, instead of thinking about lines and about hedgerows, it's thinking about what are those key components that nature needs to survive. So, you know, dense scrub, really important. Knowing which trees actually feed birds and are useful. If you look at an average forestry mix, it's full of lime and hornbeam, and these are shade-dwelling trees that create very few insects. And somebody once thought that the composition of Britain's woodlands contain those trees. But if you actually just go out and look at what birds are using in the countryside, berry-bearing trees, hawthorn, blackthorn, spindle, increasingly forgotten in the landscape, wild pear, crab, bird cherry, or, you know, in northern England, but formerly in southern England, juniper. All of these trees have a critical role in sustaining birds in this incredible seasonal landscape in which we live. And of course, in a really intensive arable landscape, the seasonality itself has been ripped out by simplifying, by creating these vast unnatural fields. But it can also be put back in. So when you're looking at systems like silvopasture, when you're looking at orchard creation, which is something we do a lot of course you can have your orchard as a fruit producing area, but it's simultaneously producing a vast byproduct of excess insects and fruit for birds. And then of course, when you're talking about designing scrub, whether that is linear scrub in the form of a hedgerow or randomized scrub as part of one of our many biodiversity net gain schemes, we deliberately design scrub grasslands, so the scrub is growing randomly within the grassland. Species like blackthorn, hawthorn, these thorny trees are a really important missing part of farms, because after the Common Agricultural Policy, the great tidying policy, the great extinction policy of our time, everything was better when it was removed. So all of the nuances, all of the little scruffy elder copses that the tree sparrows used to use, all the bits that farmers didn't bother to drain because it was a bit of a faff. Well, of course, when you pay somebody enough to do something that's bad for nature, but you don't pay them to conserve their old orchard, then unfortunately market economics and forces kick in, and a lot of farmers in the 70s, 80s and 90s were paid to grub out these micro nuances, and here we are ironically using biodiversity net gain to put them back in again. The other thing to think about is the insidious effects of glyphosate and of herbicides, and the devastatingly quiet effect they have on nullifying the food chain right from the bottom up. So if we come back to turtle doves, chickweed, knotgrass, fuma trees, scarlet pimpernel, you know, these things like growing in disturbed soil. So in a rewilding project, we'd be using pigs to rootle the soil to create the conditions for the weeds, for the turtle doves to feed on. But of course, in a agricultural landscape, you can be doing that artificially with a mechanical pig. So basically, by using the likes of glyphosate, what we're doing is we're effectively wiping the food chain right from the bottom again and again and again, and even one coat of glyphosate a year, in my view, is still infinitely more devastating than just a light till. People always talk in polar opposites, oh, it's got to be deep ploughing or glyphosate. No, it doesn't. It could be what we call a mechanical tickle. We're doing a lot of mechanical tickling with our farmers, don't quote me on that, where basically soil motivation is a part of the natural system. Elephants in Britain, and yes, we had elephants, I think 150,000 years ago, not long, were turning over lots of soil. Wild boar turn over lots of soil. And turtle doves have evolved around these species. They didn't evolve in our farms. They evolved millions of years before. So again, a really important thing to bear in mind is that creating disturbance is critical for nature, and farmers are very good at creating disturbance. And that can actually be enormously beneficial. It's amazing how often you'll find that a disturbed brownfield area, a little mound of soil that's been left at the edge of a field on Salisbury Plain, is where all your yellow wagtails and linnets are coming to find insects. So these micro disturbances, we can be building into the edge of farms, we can be building into the unproductive fields, And the other thing, of course, is water. We focus a lot on wetland, where NGOs talk about wetlands as these kind of sort of off-limits big nature reserves, like Ham Wall, Bitterns, Marsh Harriers. It's all incredibly important. But you've got to remember that every farm in Britain once had redshank. Every farm in Britain once had corncrake. And these are birds that just need soggy areas. They don't need, deep, impenetrable wetlands. But prior to the great levelling of the British farm countryside, we would have had ephemeral pools all over our farms. And one of the many things we're doing in Bristol is basically putting those back in. Sometimes we're using the original dew ponds, sometimes we're creating new ponds from scratch in a very sort of shallow, randomised format. And if you're a grey partridge, if you're a turtle dove, those little farmland ponds are really critical. So the question then is, how does this impact food production? And the answer is, it doesn't. Within each farm, there would have been fields, even 50 years ago, that no farmer would have bothered with, and it's in the non-bothered with areas that nature would have thrived. But of course, eventually, there were subsidies for almost anything that was agriculturally intensive and sometimes agriculturally destructive. So all of these little nuances have disappeared over time. And a lot of rebooting farmland bird populations is not about rewilding in totality, it's about building these micro nuances back into the landscape. So, how do we do all of that? The key reason we set up Restore was to prove that only by restoring nature can farms be economically viable. And the more people fight nature over time, the more unviable farming will become. And this journey's happened even faster than we thought, with the rising prices of all of the things that I would never want to be seeing applied to land. And at the same time, the natural capital market, carbon biodiversity net gain, biodiversity credits are allowing us a new way of placing a value on nature. Now, for somebody like me, nature has an intrinsic and innate value. I don't need a value on nature to go out and enjoy it. But if we're trying to pivot farming off 50 years of being paid through the Common Agricultural Policy and many other policies to basically harm nature, then we're going to need a massive economic pivot to go back to farming scrub, farming corn buntings, farming rotting elder, and farming ponds alongside the food that we need to eat. And if we want to be eating food that's actually good for us, we probably want to be eating food that's free from chemicals, and we probably want a food system that is highly diversified, has far more in the way of orchards and fruit production and vegetable production, and less in the form of simplified carbohydrates that we're finding out are not actually very good for us or our microbiome or our health anyway, and are terrible for nature. So a lot of what we do when we're working with farmers and landowners to redesign their farms is a fusion of ecological vision and financial expertise. So, for example, the ecological vision is often, if you're dealing with an arable farm, you're dealing with a treeless simplified landscape, so you want to be putting in your scrub, your ponds as quickly as possible, reducing your soil nutrient levels if appropriate, and trying to have farming working a little bit more in sync with the seasons. There's a huge fixation at the moment in the regenerative movement on autumn cropping, and it completely is understandable from an agricultural perspective, but it totally throws the cycle in which birds have evolved for millions of years. So if you look at a lapwing, it recognises a spring-sown field. It comes in when it's low. The field goes up at the time that the lapwing's laying its eggs and hatching its chicks, as used to happen on our floodplains before we drained them all. And therefore what the lapwing is doing, it's using a proxy of an original system. But if you give it an autumn-sown field, you completely throw the cycle. All the wading birds disappear, because it's very difficult for nature to add 2 seasons to its calendar. Lapwings are not going to start laying eggs in September and October when they've been doing it in early April for the last 2.5 million years. So it's really important, if possible, that we design farmland in a way that works in sync with these seasons, the inalienable rhythm of the British countryside, so that there are berry-bearing trees of different species throughout the year. If possible, there will always be fallow grassland that's there throughout the year for short-eared owl, for kestrel, for barn owl, There will also be areas that are prone to soil disturbance, which wading birds and turtle doves particularly like, and tree sparrows. And there will also be something that at least replicates what winter stubble used to do, which is create a year-round bounty of weeds and seeds for grey partridge and for tree sparrow. So it's working in sync with the seasons. It's creating as many food sources as possible, and then it's not making birds dependent on a food source and then wiping out that food source completely from the farm. If a particular field is ploughed or wiped in a nature, as nature would see it, and birds can just move into the adjacent field, that isn't a problem. But if an entire farm or an entire landscape is all cleansed at the same time of year, you have a big problem. Obviously, some things are just staggeringly avoidable, like cutting silage when curlews are in the middle of a field. The wider question is, why are we using silage at all? Why aren't we feeding cattle on the landscape? And this is, a key part of what we're doing at Restore, is not trying to turn back the clock to the Bronze Age. It's just trying to turn back the clock to the time where farmers and animals sustained by a complex homogeneous landscape, which is more like 100 years ago. And actually, when we look at the payments available both through government, although that's rather changeable at the moment, but for the wood pasture payments that came in under the last government to biodiversity net gain, all of these payments are actually rewarding farmers for shifting back towards, ironically perhaps, the way that many farms were being run in the 1850s to the early 1900s, that sustainable, highly heterogeneous landscape producing a lot of different types of food for people and a huge amount of accidental trophic benefit for nature. So normally when we at Restore work with a farm, we come in and we look at what's there and we baseline and all of the normal things that you would expect, but we try and put in place a really bold vision for how that farm can continue, but with nature right at the very heart of the food production system and right at the very heart of the economics that underpin that farm. When we started working in Wiltshire with what on the face of it the NFU call very economically productive land, it was staggering when we took on our first really big farm the extraordinary amount of inputs needed to get the bank balance up to zero. Minus 750,000 a year was being spent on agricultural inputs that were not strictly necessary and would not have been used in the farming system 50 years ago. I think a lot of farmers have become utterly dependent upon these and think that they're necessary. There is always an awkward pivot moment where you're trying to turn a system, for example, with glyphosate to a system with no inputs at all. And I know James Rebanks and others have found the same with when you suddenly take a whole herd of animals off ivermectins. It's not always a seamless journey, and we don't claim that it is, but it is a possible journey and a worthwhile journey. So a lot of that then goes hand in hand with the economic payments available. I know many of you will obviously be extremely aware of what's on offer, and also that there's a lot of noise and greenwash and empty promises around carbon and everything else. And I would agree. I would say that a lot of natural capital schemes are really no more than talk. And we have to try and work with our farmers and landowners and our own business to sift out the payments that are real and actually allow farmers the capital up front, not just the capital later, to pivot their farming systems and make those brave, sometimes difficult choices needed to take the inputs out, to put back fields permanently into nature that were probably never really designed or meant to be farmed, the grade 4s, the fields that the farm managers have got a rude word for. And it is working rather well, it would seem. We are now managing over 80,000 acres of British countryside on behalf of farmers and landowners, both large kind of estates that maybe aren't suitable for upland estates that aren't suitable for intensive food production, but also very much working in, most of our clients are in the English lowlands. And we're often integrating areas of what I call pure nature, permanent nature, into farmland, not in these fairly useless marginal strips, but in what you might call a sacrificial field. I only mean sacrificial in conventional agricultural terms, that we're often putting maybe 50 to 100 acres of a 500 plus acre farm into biodiversity net gain, which effectively gives everyone the stability to know that that field is ecologically, economically locked off for 30 years, which finally gives nature the time it needs to recover without the next government scheme coming along and telling you to wipe whatever it was paying you to do 5 years ago. And I think moving away from government payments is a really good thing for farmers to be doing. One of our clients said to us the other day, they said, we've become like benefits claimants. We used to be entrepreneurial. We used to create these amazing, diverse, complex farms. We used to have, orchards, pigs. We used to be creating 20, 30 different food products. And over the years, we've become utterly dependent on subsidy and the state. And I don't think it's healthy. And I have such respect for farmers. And they are my clients. And our business wouldn't run without farmers or exist. A more entrepreneurial approach to farming nature, blending not only public sector payments with private sector payments and safe with risk, but also just embracing what that land used to produce. It's extraordinary when you look at Wiltshire, for example. It's incredibly good at producing juniper and berries and gin. I'm not advocating gin necessarily, but my point is that if you look at the Herefordshire landscape, it is incredibly good at producing fruit, more so than South Africa, where we import most of our apples from. We have it literally within the soil across the UK to have all of these very complex, diversified farm systems with cereals, with high quality grazing, with orchards, with beavers, all integrated into the same landscape, not rewilding over here in a block and intensive food production over here. If we do that, we'll create a bipolar countryside, a lot of social alienation, and most importantly, all of these birds of the wider countryside, the shared countryside, the farm countryside, will vanish. So I think my final thought is scruffy is best. We always try and start with one kind of mind shift when we're working with farmers and landowners. We have become incredibly tidy in the British countryside. Lines and any form of mess is tidied away. And of course, mess is what nature likes. Mess is what nature calls home. Rotting elder, scruffy tilled areas, waste seed. I was at a farm near Bempton Cliffs, which is grade 1, so it's as productive as it gets. And it was absolutely full of corn buntings and skylarks and yellow wagtails. And I went and knocked on the farmer's door. I said, what have you done? He said, well, the first thing I did was ignore all the advice from Natural England. And he said, the second thing I did was basically I just tilled a little patch, like a little cricket strip in the middle of each field. And I just chucked in borage, the end. And that was a farmer using his own observation of what corn buntings actually do in the middle of summer, which is if you give them borage, it's just like a rugby scrum. They just go in there finding all the insects that borage provides. And that was it. And it didn't cost him anything. And it didn't have any real impact on the crop whatsoever, because you just had a little cricket strip in the middle. So I said, do you mind if I nick this idea and give it to all my clients? She said, no, absolutely. So I did. So we're now doing little mesh strips in the middle of farms from Bedfordshire to Wiltshire, and it's really working very well indeed. So the point is ingenuity and this are really going to be the key ingredients in turning farms around. You can have all the subsidies you want, all the B&G monies you want, but fundamentally it's observing what nature needs, making sure we've got space to feed nature, not just people. Thanks.
Thank you, Benedict. So we've got about 20 minutes or so for some questions, so we can take a seat or stand around.
I'll stand, I don't mind. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I think it's really interesting the story of the needs of the species and the scaling things up has been what's fascinated me when you start to look at the numbers that caterpillars needed for a pair of cuckoo and start to communicate that to a farmer and put that in the landscape, and it starts to really help people to empathise, I think, with species, with nature, and how they can contribute towards supporting them, even if some of the numbers are fascinating and scary at the same time. And then for me, I guess the other thing you mentioned in your conversation there is particularly around woodland creation and the succession of habitats and the importance of those sort of pioneer habitats, whether it's birch and willow scrub coming through when you allow natural regeneration of woodlands, or the disturbance you're creating in the annual cycle of cropping that create so much opportunity, and we often jump to the end terms of planting tree mixes which perhaps are more of a mature final woodland rather than going for a 50 or 60 year longer term vision for woodland that may come and go, may fail, create open space and allow it to naturally regenerate. So thank you for all of that. Does anyone want to kick off with any questions?
Yes. You said biodiversity net gain is really helpful for this species recovery stuff. But I'm more worried about it because we're still needing to define exactly what target habitat we're going to get exactly in what spot, rather than just kickstarting some processes and seeing where it goes. So how have you managed to use it usefully for nature?
Sure. I always think partly it's the mentality behind it. So for me, B&G is not the end result. That's really dangerous. Just like carbon being the end result is even more dangerous, because the logical thing is you cover your whole farm in Sitka spruce. So for us, B&G is a mechanism, and we, like any system, you play the system to get B&G to deliver the results you want. So it doesn't, by the way, have to be scrub grassland, but let's say the thing most missing on most farms, there is no average farm, but let's just say the average farm for the sake of answering your question, is complex integrated scrub grassland. It's dense hawthorn bramble. It's the stuff that no government subsidy or would pay you for, and it's the stuff you can't turn into anything agricultural at all. It's pure nature, if you like. So say we assign 50 acres of that to a 1,000-acre arable farm in Lincolnshire. That's a live example. That's going to have a massive uplift because it's going to create a draw. So we start with the reason and the habitat, and then we reverse engineer the process with the biodiversity net gain. Now, in Lincolnshire, for example, most developments are happening on land that is either grassland or scrubland in the form of hedgerows, which is effectively all we're doing, is we are offsetting people's valid need to have houses with nature uplift and taking advantage of a moment in the market. I don't believe biodiversity net gain will be here in 2 years. There'll be something else, but that's one for maybe later. And then we basically assign the habitat reverse engineered to the B&G metrics to deliver it. So we baseline it, imagine it's arable, so it's my ecologist knows the technical terms, but let's call it a 0 out of 10 on ecology. And then we model the 30-year uplift towards scrub grassland, turning in year 30, we hope, towards more complex wood pasture with trees coming out of the scrub and everything else. Now, the weird thing about B&G is B&G in itself is not that ambitious. We're ambitious, and our farming clients are ambitious. But really, it is still, like anything in life, when you're applying for something, a complex box-ticking exercise. So what we do is we have all the efficiencies now within Restore to make sure that whenever we're designing scrub grassland, we can do so in a way that the units can be bought within the local planning authority area. And we can do the same for wetland, and we can do the same for most habitats that can be created in 30 years, provided, of course, they have to be offsetting something that is being removed somewhere else. Has that answered your question, or? Okay. Okay, thanks.
You mentioned mindset, and are most of your clients, presumably they approach you because they want to do something, or do you ever work with people that you have to convince?
No.
So
Yeah,
you're
we
working with people have an open mind to this stuff, because that's the challenge I have in my day-to-day job, is trying to convince the dairy farmer where every blade of grass is valuable to maybe loosen his hedges up a bit.
We are very lucky. I think every client has approached us. I mean, we're still very proactive in that we plant ourselves a groundswell festival with a tent that's playing the birdsong from the 1850s, and we sort of also provide free drinks, and lots of farmers come in. But fundamentally, we get approached by about 5 clients a week, and often, funnily enough, their ambition may not be big enough for ours. So we often try and work about 500 acres, not for any kind of elitist thing, just because that's the scale at which nature begins to recover, in our view. And normally, there's still a lot of adjustment of their aspiration, our aspiration. We've got one client that's still absolutely convinced that 1 coat of glyphosate is a good idea, but that's on the 4,000 acres over here, and he does own fairly massive estate, and then he's quite happy to have rewilding on 1,000 acres. I mean, it's an unusually big estate. But the average farmer that reaches out to us has already realised that intensive farming has destroyed their wildlife, but also destroyed their bank balance. And normally they've come to that realisation pretty much at the same time. We've got a lot of intergenerationals. So we've got an incredible guy, 27 years old, who's inheriting a 1,000-acre family farm in Lincolnshire. He's been making a loss for 15 years, and he's just fed up with it, fed up with the stress. And he just wants to do something entirely different. He's read a few of my books. He's also realised that 100 years ago, the Lincolnshire wells weren't suitable for arable. They only work if you just farm the land to within an inch of its life. So he wants to turn the whole lot back to dynamic grazing. Oops, sorry. Need to wash my hands. So we are very lucky. I think normally if I was in your position appealing to those, what you might call the more hard-arsed farmers, it's what they're doing will not be economically sustainable for very long. So even if they don't think or even particularly, in some cases, care that nature isn't getting a look in, you know, the dairy industry is a classic example of an industry that has already destroyed itself. It's only subsidy that's propping it up. But yeah, that's a particularly hard win. But I think often what we're trying to do is create in each county, at least, or in each landscape, so Somerset Levels or Lincolnshire Wolds, an exemplar landscape where the farm is not only ecologically doing well, but making a heck of a lot more money, and more importantly, profit, not just revenue, through our methods. And then what you find is farmers looking over the fence with a little bit of envy going, oh, well, annoyingly, they haven't gone out of business yet. They must be doing something right. And also, I just think regardless of the nature point, diversification of a landscape or your own business or whatever, your own finances, is a really good idea. So putting all your eggs in the dairy basket or the grouse basket or the spruce basket is just equally foolish, because what happens if that industry collapses? Everyone on the Somerset Levels, farming-wise, is completely wiped out. So if you could even persuade them to put in orchards, which 50 years ago were really common on the Levels, for example, they would at least have something to fall back on if the subsidies for dairy fall away. So, yeah.
One of the challenges, though, for those types of sectors is that they're so heavily capitalised or financed that it's a hard barrier for them to overcome it. And is there a need for some more creative thinking around how to support farmers to get out of those finance agreements or remove themselves from that system that they're embedded into?
So,
Firefighting mentality, it comes across a lot.
The
firefighting mentality, they
Right.
don't have the headspace for doing anything other than their current doing.
So I think the next step for the likes of nature restoration companies, so Restore, Nattergal, whoever, is to turn up with the finance, which is what we're working on at the moment. So what we're working on at the moment is working with pension funds, water companies, such that per 1,000 acres on average, we can turn up with £1 million. Now, why would they give that to us? Well, because if we can't deal with downstream flooding risk, those water and pension funds are going to be losing billions. So for them to invest tens of millions into the likes of, or through the likes of ourselves, is actually not, in their world, big money, but in the world of transforming a mid-sized dairy farm, it's pretty transformative. I mean, I could tell you now, if I knocked on all the doors on the Somerset Levels and said, would you like to do rewilding, I wouldn't call it that, but nature creation, and I expect you to pay me for it, I think I know what the two-word answer would be. But if you turned up with the financial package, then I think your uptake would at least be 30%. I mean, there are many other factors, cultural, there's this obsession with food production, meaning intensive food production, which I strongly disagree with. Food production has to be beef, you know, lamb, dairy or cereals, which again, it doesn't. And what a diet we would have if we only ate those things. But I think transitional finance is really important, and we all know that's the case. I mean, our bias at the moment is landowners, you know, they've maybe saved enough money to at least afford us for 5 years. In about 18 months' time, the biodiversity net gain starts coming online, and they have that semi-patient capital to at least invest in about 1.5 years of restore transitional services, but to be able to turn up with the capital is the next step. Yeah.
Sammy and then Jen.
Yeah, just following on from what Sabine was saying about the BNG. So, is it the farmers that are managing the land? Like, how involved are you in the process? Do you have to do any monitoring?
Yeah.
Is it different depending on the landowner and how much experience they have, how good they are at
Yes.
identifying the requirements? Because obviously they have their way of doing things, and this is a big mindset shift, and it's very different. So just wondering how much you have to be involved in that.
Well, we're completely tailored. So just to be clear, we're not obviously a Savills in terms of having hundreds or thousands of clients. We only ever aspire to have maybe 50 at most at any one time, about 17 at the moment. So we tailor exactly to who's on the land and what they can do. So normally speaking, if you've got like our larger estate in Bedfordshire comes with a forest manager, a gamekeeper, a farm manager. That's brilliant because firstly, we support local employment. And secondly, it means that what we're doing is a lot of upskilling and training modules. But once we've done that, my goodness, does the actual change take off really quickly. And often these so-called traditional custodians like gamekeepers, the bottom line is they love nature and they love being given a new challenge. So that's been really positive. Sometimes, of course, if you're talking just, for example, an older couple farming land, they will need some extra bodies on the ground to actually carry out the work. So we do contractor management as well. We're normally very time intensive in the first 1 to 2 years for each of the interventions that we carry out. And then after that, we often find that it's been picked up by those on the ground who then take it forwards. And we always say our job is to make ourselves obsolete on any one estate or farm within 5 years. Because once we've done the finance and once we've upskilled on the nature restoration side, we're not an acquisition company. We don't want to replace farmers. We just want to upskill, finance and move on to the next one. So it's quite a scalable model. But it's entirely dependent on the farm. There is no fixed restore template. But normally we find by the time the client signed up for us for 5 years, they really want us quite involved. It's not like we're getting in the way, if that makes sense.
Jen.
Yeah, hi, that's really cool. Thank you very much. I was just really interested because we've been working for sort of 5 years on a regenerative agricultural sort of project, and my focus was really looking at barriers, what's stopping farmers when they know all that information around the most of the stuff we've been talking about. And it's really because it seems to be a huge amount of the trend that owner-occupiers can leap forward to get your sort of support because they own the land and that they can actually, just invest in their land and that transformation. We found that there's a huge challenge in tenant farmers, and actually that a lot of the farm businesses that are conventionally tied into things like supermarkets and all of that, for making their livelihoods, to keep their families sustained and their employers, they can see the vision, but they can't see how to get there.
Yes.
And so we've also been looking at, BNG. We haven't found anyone in Gloucestershire who signed a BNG contract yet because they're too complicated. And we're also working with Rebalance Earth on looking about pension investments and actually the returns that are required on those investments. And I think it's brilliant what you're doing, but it's just that how do we pivot that so that we can enable all of farmers and land managers to be able to embrace that opportunity rather than just people. We see some real inspiration from people who are owner-occupiers going into space, but I think there's a lot of people in the tail of that actually are really needing to be supported in that way, and I think that it's much harder for them. I don't know if you've got any suggestions as to how you feel the contact of the county council farmers, the people whose landowners want a good return for the land, doesn't compensate for any transition in drop of income or all of that. Is there hope for the wider farming community rather than just the big landowners, do you think?
I always refer to tenants as the last frontier. We are working on a tenants package at the moment. I don't think, by the way, that our model benefits anyone who owns or farms in hand. I can potentially unlock £2 million for a farm that's 200 acres with no money in the bank at all. So in that respect, we're trying to use B&G as a leveller, not as a increaser of social inequality, if that makes sense. That wasn't a word. But with tenants, I think it is difficult because you've got this egg timer. You've got the natural capital, you've got the facilitator, you've got the landowner, and then you've got the tenant. And the money has to come all the way to the bottom of the egg timer to impact the tenant enough for the tenant, particularly an AHA tenant too. You know, they're there, intergenerational, doing their own thing. What's the financial upside? It is very hard for them. And I think a lot of it, I mean, what we're trying to do is structure relations with the landowners where if they've got FBT or AHA tenants, firstly, it's in the landowner's interest if they're nature positive to want their tenants to go on that journey. Otherwise, you have all these bizarre situations where you've got incredible nature here and suddenly maize farmed to the edge. It's not doing anyone any good. And actually, when you look at the margins that the tenant is making on that very frankly destructive agricultural practice, they're tiny. So the amount of capital per tenant doesn't need to be astronomical to engender change, but there does need to be transitional capital available for tenants. So what we're doing with our largest landowner in Bedfordshire now is a tenancies package, which is effectively using a portion of biodiversity net gain and carbon capital that pays into a tenant's fund that is available if the tenant wishes to change. But you can't make anyone in life, you can't make anyone in life change, you can't make a tenant change. You can certainly tell them that there is 3 times more capital available for them if they turn that maize field to a sustainable permanent grassland.
And you actually have that fund in place now, do you?
We have the structure for the fund in place, and the money will arrive when the money arrives through the BNG. Which, by the way, you mentioned Gloucestershire quickly. As you probably know, there are a number of ways of doing BNG. Section 106 depends not only on how much development in your LPA, but it also depends on the aptitude and skill or not of your LPA. We often use conservation covenants because they allow us to bypass and speed up that process. And Gil Martin, who's joined us from the Belmont Estate project, his approach is completely different again. So we actually restore B&G credits to developers, sell them en masse, and then distribute them into our portfolio. So we bypass the regional effect completely, which significantly speeds up the process. Because otherwise, a lot of people at the moment who are doing B&G, they're actually just sitting in a queue. And if they didn't get in that queue first, they could be sat in the queue for a very long time. I know someone in Somerset who thinks they've sold 600 units, and I've calculated they'll be in a queue for 25 years, waiting to sell the units. So there are a lot of people, not yourself, but there are a lot of people out there doing B&G badly or thinking that by signing a Section 106 means you're going to get your capital, and it doesn't at all. My feeling is most people will not be able to sell their units if they don't have specialist advice. Then they'll become cynical about all the natural capital mechanisms, which will push them back towards taking whatever government decides to give them, which, as we know, is notoriously changeable. Yeah.
Any questions to this side, Rick, George? Going back to kind of the ecology side, how robust is this kind of like approaches of untidiness in the face of climate change? Because obviously I love the like retrospective idea of going back to kind of like 100 years ago or 1750s in terms of like the ecological commission. But obviously how does that kind of function in a changing climate? Sort of got and is coming.
It's amazing how often we forget that the native fauna and flora that we have dealt with not man-made, but extremes of climate. So hawthorn, for example, scrubland species that have been, with us for millions of years are incredibly resilient. And there's no harm in doing a nut block of walnut or planting some, weird Mediterranean tree in the hope that it will kind of be climate change proof, but it's nowhere near as sensible as working with the trees that have been with us for millions of years, that come with the insects attached, and creating resilient systems. So, I mean, if you look at flooding in Romania in the Carpathians versus flooding in Wales, the joke is very much on the people who've deforested their hills, which is us, as we're seeing every winter. Nobody mentions the real reason for the flooding isn't the amount of rain coming from the sky, it's the lack of complex Atlantic oak woodland on our hills to soak it up. So we have, it's not really even about the 1750s, it's just about the fact that we have all the native vegetation we need to be fully ready for climate change. And when you look at the effects of climate change on countries like Sweden, for example, they are considerably less pronounced than on the tree-poor, simplified, big-field United Kingdom. The Poles do not have a problem with their rivers flooding because they firstly never de-meandered many of the rivers, particularly in the east of the country, and then they built their houses above the winter flood line. And Somerset we built 10 metres below, like some kind of do not story from the Bible, and then express outrage at the Environment Agency that people's homes are flooding when they're 10 metres below sea level. So I think climate resilience is firstly, it's realising which parts of the landscape do not want to be farmed. The Somerset Levels does not want to be farmed. I don't think it can be farmed. With the sea level rise predictions, we might as well come to an arrangement where the central areas around the Parrot and the Huntsville are turned into a pelican biosphere, which is one of my ideas, rather than having a load of miserable farmers trying to farm in areas that do not want to be farmed. That's just inevitable. We can end up pretending it's not inevitable, but it is. And again, steep hillsides in Wales are crying out to be wooded so that we can graze the bottoms and the tops and actually have a robust farming system like they do in the Carpathians, where there's plenty of sheep farming and plenty of nature and plenty of flood resilience. So I don't think we need to be looking for some kind of new set of principles to protect us against climate change. The landscape and restoring the landscape will do that. We just need to give it the space to do that.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. We're coming towards the end now, lunch is coming out, but we've got time to carry on the discussion over lunch. AJ and I should have had a sweepstake as to how far you get in before we mention pelicans. So AJ, do you want to just finish with one last question?
Yeah, firstly I wanted to say rebirding I think should be mandatory reading for most people who have the influence or can manage land in this country, because it's a fantastic book. It was really inspirational to myself. But what I'd really like to ask you, the position, the outlook that you have, is where do you find your optimism to do the work that you do and to drive forward and for the British landscape?
Well, I think it's largely inbuilt. I mean, I think it comes of seeing how easy it is to have extraordinary levels of nature. The Netherlands, for example, there are living countries all around Britain and parts of Britain that are doing it. So I just think optimism becomes delusion if it's just in here and it's made up. But there are so many living systems out there showing us. The New Forest shows us that we can have extraordinary wood pasture and grazing and ancient woodland here in the UK. The speed at which the RSPB have created Ham Wall shows us we can create wetlands very rapidly. And generally speaking, I guess it comes with the fact that if we do this, the economy will be better off, people will be better off, and nature will be better off. So for me, it's actually a very much a kind of, it is a kind of business positivity and a human positivity as well as just, we've got to save nature because it's, wonderful and fluffy and everything else. It does carry immense benefits for us. And I suppose really we want to protect ourselves as a species. And the only thing that's going to do that is robust living systems. But really, I mean, since writing Rebirding, the fact that we can now run a nature restoration business with, tens of thousands of acres of clients all signing up for a paid service to do this is, I think, probably proof that the optimism wasn't delusional or unfounded. And we can keep scaling this model for anyone who wants to restore nature and normally make considerably more money from doing so than continuing to denude the countryside of nature. So it seems to be working. So I remain positive.